Chapter 8. A Tale of Many Cities. In April of 1988, a guy named John Norquist was elected mayor of Milwaukee. He'd run on a platform that was pro-public transit and anti-highway, and his message resonated with the city's voters, who are all a bunch of socialists anyway. Milwaukee is famous for electing socialist mayors. Norquist was a Democrat, but his refusal to embrace modern American car culture and the massive amounts of infrastructure it required eventually earned him a label as a fiscally conservative socialist. That characterization turned out to be a good thing for Milwaukee. Norquist had opposed highway expansion ever since his days as a Wisconsin state representative, and he raged against the mistakes of the Eisenhower Interstate System, much as Ike himself had done. After his election to the top job in Milwaukee, Norquist managed to remove a section of elevated highway called the Park East Freeway from the city's center. The freeway was intended to connect a section of downtown near the Lake Michigan waterfront to I-43, which sliced through the heart of Milwaukee on a north-south route less than a mile to the west. The Park East Freeway was always a dumb idea, running as it did alongside the confluence of I-94 and I-794, which merged with I-43 in yet another spaghetti mess of an interchange near the campus of Marquette University. The Park East was never finished, and it wasn't too difficult for Norquist to marshal the requisite support to get rid of it. The removal of the elevated freeway and the new mayor's policies kick-started a slow renaissance in downtown Milwaukee, and Norquist was eventually hailed as an urban planning hero. In 2003, an organization called the Congress for the New Urbanism, CNU, offered to hire Norquist as its director. Norquist bailed out of his mayoral job a year before his term ended to take the job. He'd been living under the shadow of sexual harassment allegations brought by a woman named Marilyn Figueroa, one of his former staff members, and he'd already decided not to run for re-election. When the CNU job offer came, Norquist jumped on it. In February of 2001, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake shook western Washington state and the city of Seattle. What became known as the Nisqually earthquake caused widespread damage to infrastructure, including an elevated portion of roadway along Seattle's western waterfront known as the Alaskan Way Viaduct. The Washington State Department of Transportation immediately set about making plans to repair the viaduct, and their actions riled up a woman named Carrie Moon. She was a member of the Seattle Design Commission, and they were tasked with reviewing public works projects in the city. For years, Moon and other like-minded urban planners had loathed the presence of the Alaskan Way Viaduct, which cut off some of Seattle's most valuable real estate from the shoreline of Elliott Bay. When WashDOT proposed repairing the viaduct, Carrie huddled with a couple of her allies, Julie Parrett, a landscape architect and professor at the University of Washington, and Grant Cogswell, a local transportation activist. Together they formed an organization called the People's Waterfront Coalition. With a name like that, they could have been mistaken for a bunch of car-hating hippies, much like the cart folks in Louisville were, the kind of group that does nothing but organize street marches, that bangs on pots and chants slogans like the disenfranchised masses so often do, just so they can feel good about themselves. Instead, the Seattle group set about proposing alternatives to the repair of the damaged viaduct. In spite of their pedigrees, they couldn't possibly have known what they were getting themselves into. They were about to become involved in an excruciatingly slow process known as the Seattle Way. The same movements that were underway in places like Milwaukee and Seattle began to happen all around the United States. In the early years of the 21st century, U.S. cities, and cities around the world, began to grapple with the highway construction mistakes of the past. The September 2008 edition of Wired magazine listed 10 highways that should be raised now, and the Alaskan Way Viaduct in Seattle was among them, because in 2008 it was still there. The article highlighted the problems caused by elevated highways all across North America. There was the Sheridan Expressway in the Bronx, the Route 5 bridge in Buffalo, Route 34 in New Haven, Connecticut, the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans, which decimated an African-American community, and Interstate 81, which did the same thing in Syracuse. There was Route 29 in Trenton, New Jersey, the Gardner Expressway in Toronto, the Southeast Freeway in Washington, D.C., and Interstate 64 in Louisville. A few months before the Wired article appeared, Tyler Allen and J.C. Stites arranged for John Norquist to come to Louisville to address the city's Metro Council. Tyler and J.C. had managed to convince the council to form an 8664 exploratory committee, and they were anxious for Norquist to relate his experiences about his successful freeway removal and development efforts in Milwaukee. None of us remembers anything about the harassment allegations against Norquist. I only learned of them while writing this book. I managed to find a few old articles about the case in the Wayback Machine Internet Archive, and in the little information that I could find, both Norquist and Figueroa presented compelling accounts in their own defense. Harassment cases where an accused is confronted by a single accuser are perhaps the most heart-wrenching. I can only remember that to us, John Norquist seemed like a really nice guy. In any event, Norquist's problems didn't affect his popularity as an advocate for the urban planning movement. This was, after all, 2008. By the time the Wired article appeared, the Ohio River Bridges Project was being threatened with litigation, not from 8664, but from Riverfields, the preservation group that represented the wealthy enclaves of northeastern metro Louisville. They were willing to do anything necessary to prevent the I-265 East End Bridge from being built, and their deep pockets meant that they could pay for plenty of lawyers. At the same time, those of us who were aligned with 8664 were doing our best to push a different vision, but it was a tough slog. During the monthly Market Street gallery hops, we'd stand in front of our large gallery posters and patiently explain to anyone who'd listen that I-64's presence along Louisville's riverfront was a terrible blight on the city. Turning the elevated portion of I-64 into a surface road would help reconnect the city to its river and spur development, we told them. It would help the city to regenerate and to flourish. Simplifying Spaghetti Junction instead of turning it into a giant flying spaghetti monster would help to preserve Butchertown, one of Louisville's oldest and most established neighborhoods. A lot of people were enthusiastic about 8664's ideas, but of course others hated them as much as the mayor and the Courier-Journal did. Some were just plain confused by our proposals, and sometimes the reactions we got from them were depressing as hell. "How am I going to get to the mall?" was a question that I was asked more than once. I felt like answering, "You're going to drive there, you dummy." But I didn't say it. Maybe I should have. It became obvious that freeways had become so ingrained in some people's minds that they couldn't conceive of a cross-town commute that didn't include travel on one. And at the heart of that mindset lay the foundations of Brace's paradox. Once cars became ubiquitous in the early part of the 20th century, scientists and engineers began to analyze how vehicular traffic behaves, how it ebbs and flows, how it expands and contracts. We studied a bit about it when I was in college, and the mathematics are fascinating, especially given their human component. There are elements of gaming theory in the analysis of traffic patterns. Humans, when presented with choices in a game, will always choose an option that they believe offers them the greatest potential reward. In the game of traffic, that reward is, of course, the minimization of the time it takes them to get from A to B. If one of those options is to take a 4-lane highway, humans will almost always make that choice. But when too many humans make the same choice at the same time, chaos reigns, as anyone who's ever been stuck in a traffic jam knows. Alternate routes are left under capacity, while the highway route quickly enters a state of overcapacity. Dietrich Brace is a German mathematician who made some detailed analysis of traffic patterns, and he figured out that sometimes reducing capacity actually increased the efficiency of a road network and therefore reduced congestion. Forcing human drivers to seek alternate routes could sometimes benefit everyone who was trying to get from A to B. The phenomenon would eventually make applications like Waze and Google Maps indispensable. But this was 2008. By the end of the year, 8664's notoriety was nearing its zenith. Drivers couldn't help but notice 8664 bumper stickers running around town. There was a lot of love-hate chatter about 8664 in the comments section of Courier-Journal articles. Leo loved us. Of course they did. By now, Stephen George was Leo's editor, and he published scads of articles in support of 8664. We even achieved a measure of crossover appeal. Some car-loving Republicans saw the merit in what we were trying to do, and they joined forces with us. Joe Bergen, who'd been a Northup campaign staffer, became an integral member of the 8664 team. I tried to recruit Patrick Neely, but by then he'd run off to a job in the thoroughbred horse industry. In December, we invited John Norquist and Carrie Moon to come to Louisville to speak at an 8664 forum. We lined up a bunch of sponsors, including the architect Brandon Clayco and his Broken Sidewalk group. Anyone in Louisville who cared about urban planning read Clayco's Broken Sidewalk blog. We booked the Muhammad Ali Center in downtown Louisville, a beautiful space that was built for Louisville's hometown hero in 2005. The building loomed over I-64, and from big-picture windows, visitors could gaze down onto the highway and to the Ohio River just beyond it. Unfortunately for me, I'd just been elected president of the Louisville Metro Democratic Club, mostly because nobody else wanted that stupid job. On the same day as the 8664 forum, the monthly Metro Dem meeting was scheduled, and since I was the incoming president, I figured that I had to at least make an appearance. It was frustrating trying to shuttle between the two events, and it made me reflect on the activism I was trying to engage in, about what mattered and what didn't. At the Bambi Bar, after a couple of beers, I decided that to do some good, I'd have to get elected to Congress, go to D.C., and kick some K Street ass. But after spending time with the 8664 crowd, I realized that working on a project to make my hometown a better place was not only a much more realistic endeavor, it was also a lot more fun. And that was when I realized that Tip O'Neill had been right. All politics is local. After the 8664 forum, I gave Carrie Moon a ride to the restaurant where a bunch of us were meeting. In the car, we talked about the different factions within the urban planning movement and their different approaches to the complex problems of making a city a better place to live. I found Carrie to be very bright and knowledgeable and very enthusiastic about Seattle, and at one point I asked her, "Why don't you run for mayor?" "I think that I can get more done by working from the outside," she told me. A few years later, she would change her mind. The forum was a great success, and afterward we did our best to keep up the pressure on elected officials and to rally more populist support for 8664. We went to transportation committee meetings of the state legislature. We sat with the good old boys in their back rooms at the Capitol. Leo ran more articles. Brandon Clayco published images taken from the grassy fields of the Great Lawn at Waterfront Park, showing how the elevated highway blocked views of the city. I'd stood on the same spots many times. We all had. Waterfront Park is a beautiful green space and an ideal place for concerts and picnics. But to enjoy themselves, visitors to the park had to be able to block out the traffic noise from the ugly elevated highway just behind it. It wasn't easy to do. After our election in 2006, I stayed in touch with David Hopp, the Courier-Journal editor who was 8664's chief antagonist. In spite of our philosophical differences, we liked each other, and it was fun for us both, I think, to snipe at one another's positions. And we bonded over our common hatred of all things Gene Snyder. The fact that Louisville's I-265 had been renamed in Snyder's honor pissed off Hopp as much as it did me. I kept telling Hopp about my life in Germany and about how well planned and organized their living spaces are. Towns in Germany are formed in tight clusters, and it's easy for residents to walk or bike to the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. Towns are almost always connected by bicycle paths and light rail systems, and in between the towns one often finds farmland. Germany's public transportation is probably the best in the world, and in much of the country it's distinctly possible to live without a car at all. Naturally, not everything about the German way of doing things is perfect. Germans love their cars, of course they do, and almost everyone has a nice one even if they can get by without it. German cars are, of course, also famous for being among the best and the fastest in the world. I lived in a little hamlet called Gerlingen that was a suburb of Stuttgart, and a short distance away lay the factories of Daimler-Benz and Porsche. Germans love to take their Porsches and their big Mercedes sedans out onto the Autobahns and drive like maniacs. I hated the Autobahns because driving on them could be both maddening and terrifying. When the highways weren't clogged with traffic, all too often I had to deal with Mach 4 Porsches that came flying by in the passing lane. When you pass a slow-moving truck on a German Autobahn, you'd best keep your eyes in the rearview mirror, because at the hypersonic speeds that Porsches travel, one of them can appear out of nowhere and be on your ass in seconds, flashing its lights and telling you to get the hell out of its way. In German, of course. And on the occasions when a hapless driver doesn't get out of the way, the result can look more like a plane crash than a car wreck. I saw plenty of frightening scenes of the aftermath of some of them. The little pieces of wreckage that were left lying on the road were sometimes barely recognizable as a car at all. Even though German towns were very walkable, in the days when I lived there I had to carefully plan my visits to German shops. In an effort to protect moms and pops from being crushed by big box stores, Germany used to have very restrictive operating hours. On weekdays, stores closed at 6:30, and on most Saturdays they closed at 2 o'clock. A lot of them took long lunch breaks, too, and for a couple of hours during the day some shops were closed up tighter than a drum. On the first Saturday of the month, stores were allowed to stay open until 6 p.m., and those were known as Lange Samstag, long Saturdays. And on Sundays, forget about it. And even though the laws were designed to protect the little guys and girls, there was an element of chauvinism built into them as well. I remember watching a German TV debate about store hours once. Some dumb politician claimed that the restrictive hours were a good thing because most of the shops were staffed by women and they needed to get home to cook dinner for their families. This was the 1980s, but even then I remember thinking that if an American politician made a statement like that, he'd have been tarred, feathered, and ridden out of town on a rail. Ironically, sometimes these days it's conservative American trad wives who say stupid shit like that. And in Germany today, any politician who said something that ignorant would also probably be ridden out of town on a rail. But at least it would be a light rail. I showed Hop pictures of the transit systems that ran throughout Metro Stuttgart. A few steps from my front door there was a streetcar stop, and from there I could ride to Stuttgart's main train station and then to the festival grounds of Cannstatter where the Stuttgart equivalent of Munich's Oktoberfest was held. Stuttgart's fest wasn't quite as big as Munich's, but its 16 tents full of drunk Germans were 15 more than I needed. And when I'd had enough, I could just stumble into a streetcar that would take me back to my front door. When I first moved to Stuttgart in 1983, their trams ran on narrow-gauge tracks that had been in use since the 1950s. At its terminus in my little hamlet of Gerlingen, the tracks made a loop around the town's center and then headed back the other way. In the early 1990s, the city of Stuttgart upgraded the entire system, and they replaced all the old trams with new, modern cars that ran on standard-gauge tracks. The upgrade meant, of course, that the entire system's tracks had to be upgraded as well. In the town of Gerlingen, the loop was replaced by a tunnel and an underground station. It was a hugely expensive undertaking, but it vastly improved the usable space in the town's center. Most of the Germans I knew supported the upgrades as being essential, but a lot of them weren't nearly as enthusiastic about another mega-project known as Stuttgart 21. Even though Germans have always been smart enough not to plow through their cities with highways, ironically, a lot of valuable city real estate is still taken up by railroad tracks. The main train station in Stuttgart was built in the 1920s, and in a manner employed by most European cities at the time, the rail lines terminated at a dead end in the main station. That was fine until the advent of high-speed rail that Germany and other European countries began to construct in the 1980s. The French TGV, Spain's AVE, and the German ICE, the Intercity Express, are all capable of speeds of 300 kilometers per hour or more. That's 186 miles per hour for arithmetically challenged Americans. At the international airport in Frankfurt, it's possible to step off of an airplane and into an ICE that will take you straight to Stuttgart. Lufthansa even runs a few trains there. They have flight numbers and automated baggage transfer from planes to trains. The ICE can get you to downtown Stuttgart faster than you can fly there, given that the city's airport lies well to the south of town. German leaders realized that their new high-speed trains were being throttled by the old-world system of tracks that ran within their cities. They proposed a project that would bury high-speed rail lines under the city of Stuttgart and route them in such a way that trains could stop at the main station and then depart in the same direction, bound for destinations like Munich to the east. At the same time, they would build other tunnels to connect other parts of the city to downtown. A light rail system already connected Stuttgart to its airport, but that wasn't good enough for the Germans. They would build a high-speed rail link to the Stuttgart airport as well. The project would be called Stuttgart 21, and it would dwarf Boston's Big Dig in its scope. Work began on Stuttgart 21 in early 2010, and its cost was estimated to be 4.5 billion euros. By 2022, that number had more than doubled, and long before then, the poor downtrodden taxpayers of Germany began to howl. Protesters took to the streets of Stuttgart, and the largest gathering involved more than 100,000 people. The protest involved a lot more than just pot-banging and slogan chanting. Sometimes the police directed water cannons on protesters, and that resulted in a few serious injuries. Stuttgart 21's detractors were agitated by more than just its cost. The destruction of old buildings and the disruption to the city during construction were also factors that fueled their anger. Before the pandemic, Carolyn and I used to return to Stuttgart fairly often to visit friends, and during several consecutive visits we arrived at the train station to find nothing but piles of plywood and a big muddy hole. The groundswell of opposition even led to the election of the Green Party to lead Stuttgart City Council, the first time in Germany's history that the Greens managed to gain control of a big city's government. The Greens are a lot like socialists, only they spend a lot more time hugging trees. Their election gave Stuttgart and Milwaukee something in common. Besides beer, that is. Eventually, David Hopp took a vacation to Germany, and he came back very impressed, especially with their transit system. "See," I gloated, "the Germans have us beat all to hell." For me, it was a small moment of triumph in our little tete-a-tete. But I admitted to him that I wondered how the Germans managed to pull it all off. In 1990, West Germany absorbed a damaged and debt-ridden country of 16 million people. They spent billions rebuilding it. When adoption of the euro was completed at the turn of the century, at least a third of its value was underwritten by the old Deutschmark, probably a lot more. And yet Germany still managed to finance stupendously expensive projects like Stuttgart 21, and most Germans enjoyed a very high quality of life. It seems that for Germans it was simply a matter of priorities. While they were building infrastructure, the United States was spending $1 trillion just to blow up Iraq. In July of 2009, Jerry Abramson surprised us all by announcing that he would not be running for re-election when his term ended the following year. Louisville's mayor for life had worked a deal with Steve Beshear, the Democratic governor of Kentucky, to be his running mate in the gubernatorial election of 2011. Within days of Abramson's decision, a boatload of local Democrats expressed an interest in entering the race to replace him. Among them was Tyler Allen. "You want to run for mayor? WTF!" That was the reaction of a lot of people in the 86-64 group. They didn't understand why the hell he'd want to do that. But I did. At least I understood how he felt. Once upon a time I'd felt the same way. I understood his motivation, and I admired him for not even having to go to the Bambi bar first to think about it. Everybody assumed that Tyler's desire to be mayor was all about 86-64, of course, and that his candidacy would be a de facto referendum on the highway's removal. But for Tyler it was about a lot more than that. I'd gotten to know him fairly well by then, and I know that his motives were sincere and that his goals were about a lot more than just tearing down a freeway on Louisville's waterfront. Once upon a time he'd raged against other urban planning controversies, like the construction of Louisville's new downtown arena. By the turn of the century, old Freedom Hall, where JFK had spoken, was getting long in the tooth. The roof kept leaking. The amenities it could offer were no longer in keeping with the demands of the modern college basketball world's millionaire class. There was a lengthy debate about what to build and where. Some factions wanted a new arena adjacent to the old one. Others wanted it to be built in downtown Louisville on the site of an old electric company substation and adjacent to I-64 like the Ali Center was. But there was another potential site, once used by the Louisville Water Company. An arena could be built there faster and cheaper than it could be near the riverfront. The site was only a 5-minute walk from 4th Street Live, a pedestrian-only galleria of restaurants and bars that Louisville began to develop in the 1970s as a way to draw people back into the city. Building on the old water company site would have given Louisville a venue that mimicked rival Nashville's Bridgestone Arena. NB. The Bridgestone Arena has had a whole bunch of names in its young life, including the boring but descriptive moniker Nashville Arena. But of course, the corporation that wins the most recent What Have You Done For Me Lately contest gets to name it whatever it wants. Nashville's arena is home to the city's beloved hockey team, the Predators. The words Nashville and hockey don't seem like they belong in the same sentence, but the people of Nashville are crazy about their Preds. The arena can hold over 17,000 hockey fans, and most of the time games are sold out. Carolyn and I have been to a couple of matches there, always of course to see her own beloved Montreal Canadiens when they're in town. And of course she always makes me wear a Montreal jersey when we go. Wearing a Canadiens jersey in a place like Boston can get you killed, but not in Nashville. Predators fans are as nice and polite and as magnanimous as human beings can be. Regardless of the outcome, some fan will always say something to us like, "Hey, great game, see you in the playoffs." Whatever there is to love or hate about the South, it's impossible to ignore the fact that most people there are friendly and kind. After hockey games, fans pour out of the Bridgestone Arena and onto Broadway, the home of Nashville's famous honky-tonks. An hours-long party ensues, and the atmosphere is full of energy. A new arena on the old water company site would have created the same kind of post-game vibe for Louisville. David Jones, the co-founder of the insurance giant Humana, lobbied hard for the arena to be built on the water company site. So did Papa John's founder John Schnatter. People paid attention to Schnatter back then because he hadn't yet said enough stupid shit to convince everyone that he was a bigoted idiot. In spite of support from the city's business leaders, Tyler among them, a state task force decided that the new arena would be built near the river. The arena's What Have You Done For Me Lately contest was won by Yum Brands, the Louisville-based parent company of culinary monstrosities KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell. The Yum Center opened in 2010 with perhaps the dumbest name ever given to an arena. It was decadent and depraved, and its financial problems would eventually cost the city dearly. Tyler faced some very big obstacles in his mayoral bid from the army of other Democrats who also wanted the job. Some of them were people he knew well and who were well known. Eventually, 8 candidates filed for the following year's Democratic primary, among them 2 prominent members of the city's Metro Council, as well as good old Burl Farnsley. But there was another guy who decided to run, and his name was Greg Fisher. Fisher is a Louisville native who'd started a very successful business with his father and brother. Long before nugget ice became a thing, their company manufactured ice-making and vending machines. They went worldwide with their wares, and in 1997 the family cashed out for buckets of megabucks. After the sale, Greg dabbled in other business ventures until 2008 when he decided to run for U.S. Senate. In a crowded primary field, he got his butt kicked by another businessman named Bruce Lunsford, 51-34. In the general election that year, Lunsford made a credible showing against the invincible Mitch. He only lost 53-47. Democrats usually lose Kentucky Senate races by a lot more than that, especially when they're running against Mitch. I'd met Greg several times, and he seemed like a genuinely nice guy. When he decided to launch his Senate bid, he started hanging out at Louisville Metro Democratic Club meetings, and since I was the club president, we gabbed quite a bit. After his primary Senate loss, I even went to his old campaign office to scarf up all his excess yard sign wire frames. We wanted them for $86.64. Naturally, the frames were just a little bit bigger than the $86.64 signs, which were glorified plastic bags, and when we tried to stretch them to fit over Greg's old frames, the signs kept tearing, so we finally gave up. We ended up with a ton of useless wire that we stored in the $86.64 gallery for months. I can no longer remember what happened to all that metal. I hope that somebody took it to a scrapyard. At 8 cents a pound, they could have made themselves a fair amount of cash. In September of 2009, Riverfields made good on its threat, and they filed a lawsuit to stop construction of Louisville's East End Bridge. Other organizations piled on, some in support and some in opposition. The major mayoral candidates, including Fisher, voiced their support for completion of the bridges project as intended, with 2 bridges and a redesigned giant flying spaghetti monster of an interchange. Only Tyler stood in opposition. That same month, he filed his papers to make it official. Like it or not, his campaign had become a referendum on 86-64. Once Fisher announced his candidacy, it didn't take me long to figure out that the mayoral primary was over. Almost every Democrat I talked to said that they were going to back him. But Tyler was committed, and I decided that I'd work for him anyway. If he wanted to lead a bunch of soldiers in a desperate battle, I was willing to follow him. I liked desperate battles. Tyler's first campaign staff meeting was held in the living room of our little house in the hippy-dippy Highlands. By coincidence, a buddy of mine named John Coates was in town, and I invited him to sit in on the proceedings. John's a Harvard law professor, and he'd come to Louisville to work on some big merger and acquisition case. "I can't tell you who my client is," he told me when he arrived, "but do you know Mr. Burns on The Simpsons? My client is Mr. Burns." I'm still trying to figure out who the hell in Louisville owns a nuclear power plant. John has a long string of credentials behind his name, and he chaired Elena Kagan's hiring committee when she became dean of the Harvard Law School. He'd been to dinner parties with Elizabeth Warren. Despite his hefty resume, John is a self-effaced and humble guy. When I found out that he'd been appointed to Obama's Economic Advisory Council, I said to him, "Gee, that's pretty cool." "It's no big deal," John answered. "There are about 100 of us on the council." "Well, John," I answered back, "there are about 320 million of us who aren't on the council." Law professor Coates was fascinated by Kentucky's practice of electing judges, and during our living room campaign meeting, he became particularly interested in our discussions about one judicial candidate named Katie King. The King name was well known around town. Her father, Jim King, was a wealthy businessman and one of the Metro Council members who'd also filed to run for mayor. Tyler knew him quite well. Because of the family's notoriety, people in town loved to gossip about Katie King's personal life, and they painted her as a bit of a wild child who was wholly unsuited to be a judge. John decided to use the Katie King story as a case study for his law school students. At another one of our living room meetings, a guy showed up who I'd never seen before. I assumed that Tyler had invited him, but when the meeting was over, he asked me who the stranger was. "I didn't know," I told him. "I thought that you'd brought him." The mystery guy's name was Curtis Morrison, and he ended up being one of the more interesting characters I've ever met. He happened to live just down the street from our house, and somehow he'd found out about our campaign meeting, and so he decided to invite himself. Curtis became one of Tyler's most dedicated volunteers, and without question its most colorful, and I'm grateful that he decided to crash our party. Curtis had grown up a poor trailer park kid in southern Indiana, and his dream was to become a lawyer. He was gay, but he wasn't just gay. He was Randy Rainbow gay, and that was what made him fun to be around. I have a vivid memory of standing on a street corner with Curtis in the middle of the hippy-dippy Highlands, waving big Tyler for Mayor signs in the days leading up to the primary. Seemingly at random, Curtis hollered, "I need a husband." I really loved the guy. We all did. A few years later, Curtis would land himself in some pretty warm water for eavesdropping on Mitch McConnell. Tyler was a successful businessman in his own right. His father founded one of Louisville's biggest accounting firms, and Tyler owned a printing company that produces large-format banners. Anyone who drives around Louisville can't help but notice images on the sides of buildings like Jennifer's Louisville, a huge black-and-white portrait of hometown girl Jennifer Lawrence that Tyler's company produced. He had enough bucks to self-finance a small but real campaign, and he managed to raise a little money from some gullible small donors like me, so he hired one paid staffer, a guy named Andy Cornelius, who was president of the Butchertown Neighborhood Association. Besides opposition to the Bridges project that threatened to eviscerate their neighborhood, the Butchertown group did battle with Swift & Company, a meatpacking business whose Louisville operations slaughtered 10,000 pigs a day in a nearby factory. All too often, the nonstop Swift slaughterhouse made the entire neighborhood smell like a mixture of bleach and bacon. It still does. Tyler set up his first real campaign office in a ramshackle wooden building next door to a joint called Zanzibar, a little south of downtown Louisville. The Z-Bar is at least as well known around town as the Bambi is, and has been around a lot longer, since 1938. So had the building that housed Tyler's office, and it wasn't long before he determined that he needed to find better digs. It was nice, though, after spending several hours in Tyler's dingy office, to go next door to the Z-Bar, grab a beer, and shoot the shit for a while. The Z-Bar plays host to scores of reasonably well-known musicians, and by coincidence it was filled with pinball machines that were supplied by Matt Flights, the software engineer from our office who'd convinced me to run when we gathered at the Bambi Bar back in 2006. Matt and his brother collect vintage pinball machines, and once upon a time they ran an annual arcade show in town. Matt's presence in both places drew a line between the bars that had political significance for me, but I didn't yet see it. Andy Cornelius proved himself to be an adept political operative. Apparently, doing battle with the builders of bridges and the slaughterers of pigs had given him exactly the kind of combat experience he needed for a mayoral campaign. He impressed the hell out of us one evening when we were confronted by a hostile civilian. Just as we were leaving the office for the day, a frumpy middle-aged woman walked by, and she stopped and stared at the sign that Tyler had erected over the entrance. "Tyler Allen for mayor," she snorted. "What's his position on abortion?" Is that really an issue in a mayoral campaign?" I asked her. "It is to me," she bellowed. Then Andy took charge. I can no longer remember exactly what he told the woman, nor can Andy, and that's a shame, because whatever he said made it sound as though Tyler loved to both kiss and kill babies. It was masterful. It was a single-sentence answer that could mollify both rabid pro-lifers and pro-choicers, and I really wished that we had written it down. It was gold. Nevertheless, it failed to impress the frumpy woman, and she just grunted and walked away. Tyler eventually found a much better office space in Billy Goat Strut, which has to be the coolest office name on the planet. The offices were in an old building in Nulu, wedged between Main Street and Billy Goat Strut Alley and less than a block east of where I-65 sliced through the city. We set up desks and phones, and because I was an IT guy, I strung together a rudimentary network of servers and workstations. For the first time since I'd achieved the self-appointed rank of general in my own little army, I was a commissioned officer in a real campaign organization. And for the first time, I got to see Vote Builder. When I attended one Metro Democratic Club meeting in 2006, before I decided to run, a speaker gave the audience a brief but ominous presentation. "The Republicans have something," he said. "They've begun to assemble voter data into a massive and coherent database, and they're beginning to use that data to target specific voters in very sophisticated ways. Something similar for Democrats is being worked on," he said, "but we don't have it yet." When I first saw Vote Builder during Tyler's campaign, I couldn't help but think about the clumsy comma-delimited files that the Kentucky Democratic Party had dumped on me in 2006, only 4 years earlier. If I hadn't been a geek for a living, the data would have been completely useless. As it was, the data was barely useful. But now, at last, any campaign volunteer who could maneuver a mouse could perform useful work to target voters. But doing so still required a massive amount of ground pounding. Identifying voters who were likely to vote in a given election was one thing, reaching them was something entirely different. Sometime that same fall, I started doing occasional lunches with Brooke Pardue. By then she'd taken a job working in John Yarmouth's Louisville office, and besides being political buddies, we had plenty to talk about because of her husband Tom's leukemia diagnosis. At the time, Tom was still struggling. Some nights he had to try sleeping sitting up, laying his head on the back of his couch with his arms draped over it to keep from coughing. The therapies he was undergoing were brutal, and to get them he had to go to Texas. M.D. Anderson. Bone marrow samples, bone marrow transplants, T-cell transplants, NK cell transplants. Hearing Brooke's stories about Tom were like seeing my own ghost of Christmas future, and they were intimidating. What was just as intimidating were the limits of my private health insurance, which I'd gotten from Anthem. There was a lifetime cap on the amount the policy would pay, and even though the cap was several $1,000,000, I had no idea if it would be enough if I got very sick, like Tom, and if I lingered for a very long time. And at the slightest pretext, Anthem could cancel my insurance or deny my claims, and I'd have been screwed. Carolyn would have been screwed. Probably my little company would have been screwed. I'd seen it happen to others, and not just in Michael Moore's sicko, but to people I knew. After they kicked Republicans' asses in the fall elections of 2008, Democrats finally had the federal horsepower they needed to enact some meaningful health care reform. The next year they drafted the Affordable Care Act, known of course to just about everyone as Obamacare. But the ACA was a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow, and Republicans did everything they could to make it even tougher. Sarah Palin said a bunch of stupid shit about death panels, and a lot of people believed her. In 2009, most Joe and Jane six-packs were still lusting after Palin, and her message resonated with them, even though it was complete nonsense. A Democratic representative from Florida named Alan Grayson fired back. The alternative Republican health care plan is simple, he said. Don't get sick, but if you do, die quickly. That message certainly resonated with me. It resonated with a lot of people I knew, but it was a remark that would eventually cost Grayson his job. In the late summer of 2009, Democratic congressional representatives were dispatched to their home districts to pitch the ACA to the American people. Brooke set up John Yarmouth's show, and on the 2nd of September 2009, the huddled masses of Metro Louisville descended on Central High School in the city's West End for an ACA town hall. John would deliver his spiel in the high school's gym, and he'd take questions from the audience and from the moderator, Francine Cuccinello from WHAS. I was very grateful that Brooke had managed to book Francine, even though we all knew that she'd brook no bullshit from John, or from anybody else for that matter. She would be tough but fair, and she'd ask the questions that needed to be asked. We'd all heard rumors that Republican operatives were planning to sabotage the ACA town halls around the country by packing them with hostile audiences. Brooke told me that she thought about issuing free tickets for the Louisville event, but then she heard that Republicans in southern Indiana were planning to scarf up as many tickets as possible. It was possible she'd heard that they were going to employ a different strategy and be no-shows. She announced that anyone was welcome to attend, but those who could demonstrate that they resided in our Kentucky 3rd Congressional District would be given priority in line. And it proved to be one hell of a line. When Carolyn and I arrived, the queue was already wrapped halfway around the school. Poor Brooke. Being the showrunner for an event like that had to be harrowing. But when we saw her running up and down the lines of people, she was still smiling like she almost always was. I only managed to exchange a couple of words with her as she passed by us, but that was okay. I knew that we were all going to meet at an outdoor bar later for a town hall after-party. I struck up a conversation with a guy standing next to us in line, and it quickly became apparent that he was not a fan of the ACA. What about people like me? I asked him. Small business owner, incurable pre-existing condition. What happens to me, my family, and my business if I lose my health insurance and get very sick? I asked him. What happens if my claims are denied? His answer floored me. We can't afford to worry about people like you, he said. A lot of Republicans love social Darwinism. When it came to people like me, this guy seemed to embrace biological Darwinism as well. The gym was packed, and it was hot. I estimated that the crowd was about evenly divided between friendly and hostile spectators. I didn't envy John at all for what he had to do, and it made me glad that it was him up on that stage and not me. Town halls, suffocating gyms, hostile audiences. I hadn't thought about any of that at the Bambi Bar. There were a lot of things that I hadn't thought about. John held his own in the face of some tough questioning from Francine and some withering fire from some of the audience members, and for a while the event proceeded in a loud but reasonably civil manner, until the subject of illegal immigrants came up. What about health care for those who are in the country illegally, the audience wanted to know. "We'll make some provisions for them," John said. "Emergency services, emergency Medicaid. There will be non-emergency services available at community health centers and some hospitals." That answer didn't sit well with some in the audience. One 20-something guy stood up and yelled, "Build the wall!" He was all taut and angry. He looked like one of those guys who's built on a frame of coil springs instead of a skeleton. For some reason, all of those guys seemed to be Republicans. And of course, as soon as he mentioned the wall, the discussion quickly degenerated into a screaming match about illegal immigration. When it was over, we all repaired to a bar with a big outdoor terrace. I could no longer remember where it was, but it doesn't matter. I sat next to John and we gabbed for a few minutes, and he seemed none the worse for wear after the grilling he'd just gotten. He was getting used to this shit. I spotted Francine, and we grabbed the last 2 open seats at a picnic table. We'd been corresponding by email a bit, but I hadn't seen her in ages, and it was nice to be able to sit with her again in 3D, gab, and catch up. I can also no longer remember which of those conversations I was in the middle of when an apparition appeared in front of my face, but I can never forget the apparition. It belonged to Julie Carr, and she was John's D.C. Chief of Staff. "You need to move. John needs to talk to Francine," the apparition said. Julie was a human jackhammer. In my mercifully few encounters with her, I was always left feeling as though I'd been crushed into rubble. Julie was perfect for D.C. I was happy to cede my seat, but I resented the way that jackhammer Julie pried me out of it. I particularly resented it later because it abbreviated the time that I got to spend with Francine, and that night in September of 2009 was the last time I ever saw her. In January of 2010, she suffered a heart attack, and a few days later she died. She'd never had any health issues that we knew of, and her sudden death shocked us all. Her last words on the radio were, "Go play in the snow, have some fun. Remember that life is short." And for Francine and those of us who knew her, it was far too short. Francine Cuccinello was only 43. In the spring of 2010, I had lunch with Brooke, and we raised a glass in memory of Francine and to the passage of the ACA. The glasses we raised were actually just plastic cups of lemonade. Whenever we managed to do lunch, it was always at a sandwich shop just a block from Brooke's office. The life of a congressional staffer didn't allow for much of anything else. We both acknowledged that Obamacare should probably have been called Pelosi Care. Without Nancy, none of it would have ever happened, and Barack Obama would be the first to admit it. Garrett Adams wasn't at all happy about the ACA. It fell far short of his desires for a nationwide single-payer health care system. "Oh, come on, Garrett," I chided him. "At least it's a start. At least now people like Brooke's husband and me have some protections against big bad insurance companies." But of course the ACA was far less about people like Tom and me, and far more about providing health care coverage for people who had nothing at all. And in 2010, that was 1/4 of all the people in Kentucky. Around that same time, the mayoral primary debates began, and I attended as many of them as I could stomach. With so many people on stage, the events were more circus than debate, and they were uniformly boring, to me at least. Besides Greg Fisher, Tyler Allen, and Jim King, another prominent Metro Council member named David Tandy had filed to run. David is a great guy, a big sunny teddy bear of a man who was well liked by just about everybody. Since I didn't give Tyler much of a chance, I found myself secretly hoping that David would somehow beat Greg Fisher. But we all knew that it wasn't going to happen. The only fun debate moments were provided by one minor candidate who was genuinely tinfoil hat crazy. She kept telling anyone who would listen, as well as anyone who wouldn't, that her house was being bombarded by electromagnetic energy. It was the police doing it, she said. Or maybe it was the power company. Or maybe it was aliens. Listening to her ramble on stage, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe we shouldn't tighten up our requirements for those seeking political office. Democracy may be a pretty cool way to run a government, I remember thinking, but a little candidate filtering might not be a bad idea. I only saw Burl Farnsley once during the entire campaign, and that was on TV during a debate that I didn't attend. He seemed angry and agitated, and it was obvious that his mental state had deteriorated badly since the days when I first knew him. At one point in the debate, he unleashed a string of profanities and walked off the stage. Seeing that made me incredibly sad. By May, it was beginning to weigh on me how long, how tedious, and how boring American political campaigns can be. The endless forums, the same words over and over. Even the adrenaline rushes that I'd felt during my own campaign had been tempered by long days of sheer boredom. I remember sitting with Tyler one afternoon in his office a few days before his primary, and I asked him, "What's wrong with this picture? Here we sit in what, the 28th largest city in the United States? in a primary campaign for mayor. We've been at it for almost half a year, and we're still half a year away from the general election. Meanwhile, the English called a national election, and it's already done. And they had, and it was. On the 12th of April 2010, the English Parliament was dissolved at the request of then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and an election was called. His maneuver turned out to be a blunder, and on the 6th of May he got his butt kicked by David Cameron, 36-29. A Liberal Democrat named Nick Clegg got most of the rest. But they'd done it all in less than a month. Most modern democracies limit their campaigns to 6 weeks, but Americans never really stop campaigning. Or raising money. The way that we conduct our elections is just plain stupid, but it's impossible to know just how stupid it all is until you've worked on a campaign. It wasn't all bad. Watching Curtis Morrison holler, "I need a husband" on a busy street corner almost made the entire mayoral primary worth it for me. But probably the best part came when I met Stacy and Amador. They walked up to me one day while I was prowling the sidewalks of the Crescent Hill neighborhood, handing out seditious Tyler Allen campaign literature to anyone who would take it. Stacy Servo and Amador Della Torre were an early 30s-something couple, and they were recent transplants to Louisville from Seattle. To me, they were the poster children for what Louisville, or any city, should aspire to. Stacy was originally from Montana, and Amador was from L.A., so they had little knowledge of the USA that lay east of the Mississippi River before they moved to town. When they decided that the crushing cost of living in Seattle had become too much, they started a nationwide hunt for a new place to live, and they ultimately chose Louisville. Like Carolyn and me, they'd discovered that Louisville offers very good bang for the buck. But they'd chosen to live downtown, assuming that they'd have access to the same amenities that they'd grown used to in Seattle. Unfortunately, in 2010, Louisville's downtown had little more to offer than it did when I listened to the other young woman from Seattle at the Mayor Jair fundraiser in 2005. But Stacy and Amador were happy with their choice anyway, and they quickly assimilated themselves into local society. He involved himself in real estate, and she founded an organization called New to Lou as a way to network other young professionals who'd just moved to town. It was a cool idea that she eventually exported to Seattle. Even though I knew that Tyler's campaign was going nowhere, the consolation prize of meeting some intriguing people made it all worthwhile. Tyler lost, of course. He finished a distant 4th in the field of 8. Nobody was going to beat Greg Fisher, but we'd at least hoped for a credible showing to boost 86-64's influence. We didn't get it. The final score was Greg Fisher 45, David Tandy 20, Jim King 19, and Tyler 9.5. Burl got 1,000 votes, or a little over 1%. The tinfoil hat lady got 41 more votes than Burl did. On November 2, 2010, Greg Fisher was elected mayor of Louisville. He narrowly beat a Republican Metro Council member named Hal Heiner 51-48. Given what would happen during Greg Fisher's tenure, maybe Hal was a lucky loser. I confess that I voted for Hal, mostly because he was an engineer. We'd graduated from the same engineering school. Our 86-64 buddy Joe Bergen worked on Heiner's campaign staff. I had nothing against Greg, but I thought that Hal would have made a fine mayor. And I didn't really care about his position on abortion. Hal Heiner was the last Republican I ever voted for. That same night, John Yarmouth held off a tough challenge from a guy named Todd Lally, 55-44. I was especially relieved at that outcome, not just because I wanted John to win, but because I really wanted Lally to lose. He was an arrogant ass in the Gene Snyder mold, and he ran around town during the fall campaign saying all kinds of stupid shit. None of it is worth repeating here because Mr. Lally has since faded into political insignificance, and none of it really matters anymore anyway. John's Democratic colleagues in the Congress didn't fare so well that night in November of 2010. In fact, they got their asses kicked. Republicans picked up 63 seats in the House of Representatives and 7 in the Senate. Of course, there were factors other than Obamacare at play, but passage of the ACA had obviously come at a great cost. Part of that cost was the loss of Alan Grayson's seat. After his die quickly remarks, Republicans poured money into the campaign to defeat him, and they succeeded. 86-64 lost, too. Of course it did. Not in 2010, but a few years later. In hindsight, the Ohio River Bridges project was a done deal from the moment the governors of Indiana and Kentucky signed on to it in 2002. No amount of pot-banging, backroom buttonholing, gallery hopping, or tilting at windmills campaigning was going to stop it. We fought a desperate battle, and we lost. But at least we tried. Construction on the bridges project began in the summer of 2013, and by the end of 2015, Louisville had a second downtown bridge to carry I-65 traffic, the Abraham Lincoln. A year later, the Lewis and Clark Bridge was finished, and motorists on the Gene Snyder Freeway in northeast Louisville finally had a way to cross the Ohio River. The bridge's name was chosen by Indiana Governor Mike Pence, but by the time the bridge was dedicated, he was no longer the governor of Indiana. He was vice president-elect. Riverfield scored a partial victory. They succeeded in the incorporation of a detour and an 1,800-foot-long tunnel into the East End Bridge project plans, all in the name of historic preservation. The changes ended up costing $500 million. At least Butchertown was spared from extinction. The Bridges project decided to change the location of its redesigned giant flying spaghetti monster, and when it was finished, the monster's new noodles barely grazed the old neighborhood. In February of 2019, the city of Seattle finally got rid of the Alaskan Way Viaduct. Despite opposition from the mayor and groups like the People's Waterfront Coalition, it had been decided to replace the viaduct with a car-centric solution, a bored tunnel underneath the old viaduct at a cost of over $3 billion. During the long years of wrangling since the Nisqually earthquake in 2001, opponents had argued for a simpler solution that included a surface road and transportation improvements that would have obviated the need for the hideously expensive tunnel. But they lost. 2 years before the viaduct was finally raised, Carrie Moon decided to run for mayor of Seattle. The frustrations of the long, slow, and expensive replacement project were most certainly factors that motivated her to change her mind about working outside the process. For years, newspapers referred to decision-making in the city as the Seattle Way or the Seattle Process. Consensus through exhaustion, they said. A columnist named Ted Van Dyke of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer wrote, "The Seattle Way usually is defined as circular consultation reaching indecision, but it also consists of an uninvolved electorate and public decisions taken carelessly, without regard for experience elsewhere and unmindful of consequence." They were sentences that I wish David Hopp had written in Louisville's Courier-Journal, but of course he hadn't. Carrie Moon finished second in Seattle's nonpartisan mayoral primary in August of 2017, and that qualified her for a runoff in the fall against a former federal prosecutor named Jenny Durkin. I watched a few minutes of a debate between the two women on YouTube, and it was kind of fun. Since it was just the two of them, they had time to talk about real issues, and nobody wore a tinfoil hat. Durkin got herself into a bit of hot water at one candidate forum for tossing airline-sized tequila bottles into the crowd, who she thought were all adults. She also screwed up once and said colored person when, she said later, she meant to say person of color. Nevertheless, on November 7, 2017, Carrie Moon lost to Jenny Durkin, 56-44. As far as I know, no one ever asked either of them about abortion. In the early fall of 2022, Tyler Allen finally visited us in Montreal. I'd been bugging him for years to come to my adopted hometown, if for no other reason than to see the Bonaventure Freeway project. It was Montreal's analog to I-64 in Louisville, an elevated highway that ran through the city, across a canal near Old Town, and then towards the site of Expo 67, the Montreal World's Fair for which it was built. NB, World's Fairs were things that people used to do in the old days before there were any internets. It was a way for them to get together and show everyone else what they were up to. The Bonaventure Freeway was a blight on Montreal's harbor, and in the early part of the new century an initiative was undertaken to replace its viaduct with a surface road and to open the surrounding area for development. It was almost exactly the kind of project that 8664 would have been. When reconstruction was finished in 2017, the formerly viaduct-afflicted harbor area was transformed into green spaces and public displays of art. J.C. Stites had come to see it, but Tyler never had, until now. Tyler loves to ride bikes, and he'd schlepped his own all the way from Louisville to Montreal on the back of his car. We rode our bikes all over town, which is by far the best way to tour a city anyway. Montreal has an extensive network of beautiful bike paths, and it's usually mentioned in listicles of the world's best bicycle cities. We rode across a bridge over the St. Lawrence Seaway to the L'Île Notre-Dame, where Expo 67 was held. The island is also home to the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, a racetrack that's the site of the annual Canadian Grand Prix. Tyler's also a huge Formula One fan, so he got a kick out of riding his bike around the track, and we made a couple of circuits. When it's not in use for racing, the track is open for bicycle and vehicular traffic. A lot of serious cyclists go to train there, and they ignore the speed limits and stop signs that cars can't. After our tour, we headed back to Montreal's Old Town where Tyler and his family were staying. At one point I asked him to stop, and we paused on a little berm that gave us a clear view of the Bonaventure Freeway at the spot where its viaduct over the canal had been transformed into a surface road. Tyler started taking pictures. "This should have been Louisville, eh?" I said to him. But he didn't answer. His mind was a million miles away, and he was thinking about 1,000 different things, like he almost always was. In the 1950s, the city of Seoul, Korea started building an elevated highway over the top of the Cheongye-cheong River. That's Cheongye-chun for phonetically challenged Americans. The Cheongye-chun is a small tributary of the much larger Han River, and it runs on an east-west course north of the Han through the heart of downtown Seoul. Construction of the highway seemed like a good idea at the time. The waters of the tributary were badly polluted, and the city needed more road capacity for its rapidly expanding population. But a half-century later, some enlightened urban planners realized that construction of the elevated highway had been a terrible mistake. It smothered some of Seoul's most valuable real estate. The ugly concrete of the elevated highway, the traffic noise, and the polluted tributary created an inhumane dead zone in the center of the city. In 2002, a guy named Lee Myung-bak ran for mayor of Seoul. His platform emphasized the raising of the viaduct that ran above the Cheongye-cheong and the restoration of its environment. He won, and the next year removal of the freeway began. His opponents howled. Loss of the freeway's capacity would cause traffic chaos, they said. But the highway's removal and the cleanup of the tributary created a linear park-like space through the city. Commerce flourished, and in many places in urban Seoul, traffic flow improved. Not only had Mayor Lee salvaged some of Seoul's most valuable real estate, he'd proven Brace's paradox. One of my favorite images from all the urban planning literature I've ever come across is a picture of Mayor Lee, sitting barefoot on a rock in the restored and liberated Cheongye-cheong. His pant legs are rolled up and he has a big grin on his face. Sitting on my bicycle next to Tyler on that berm in Montreal that afternoon in the fall of 2022, it made me a little sad to think that he would never be another Mayor Lee. Neither would Carrie Moon. But maybe someday, I thought to myself, in some other city somewhere, some other people will be.